The man on the bench rain had been falling all morning, a thin, steady drizzle that blurred the streets of San Francisco. Sundar Pichai walked quickly, his leather shoes tapping softly on the wet pavement. He had just left an important meeting. At Google's headquarters, where everyone had been talking about artificial intelligence and the future of search, his mind was heavy with thoughts. But something strange caught his eyes that made him stop walking. There, sitting alone on a wooden bench near the corner of Mission Street, was a homeless man. His beard was long and tangled, his shoes were torn, and beside him was a shopping cart full of old newspapers and plastic bags. But what struck Sundar was the bright red Tesla shirt the man wore. It was faded but clean, almost out of place against his otherwise rough appearance. And the man, he was staring straight at Sundar as if he had been waiting for him. Sundar hesitated. He never stopped when walking to his car. His assistant was already waiting with the door open, but something about that man's eyes, calm, yet intense, pulled him closer. "Do I know you?" Sundar asked softly, stepping toward the bench. The man smiled faintly, but didn't answer right away. Instead, he gestured to the empty spot beside him. For a moment, Sundar thought of turning back. The street was busy, people passing by without even looking at them, but something inside him whispered that this moment mattered. He sat down. The man's voice was low and raspy, yet clear. "You used to believe in things," he said. "Big things. Now you just build things." Sundar's chest tightened. He looked closer at the man, searching his face for clues. "What do you mean?" Sundar asked. The man chuckled softly, a dry sound. "You'll see, if you stay long enough to listen." And then he reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. With careful fingers, he handed it to Sundar. On the paper was a simple map. No words, no names, just a line that curved toward a dark spot marked with a circle. Before Sundar could ask anything, the man stood up. "Follow it," he said. "But don't bring anyone else." Sundar blinked, surprised by the sudden urgency. "Who are you?" The man just smiled again. "You'll know when you get there." Then he walked away, pushing his cart with a strange determination. Sundar sat frozen for a moment, staring down at the map, feeling the weight of the rain soaking through his jacket. That night he couldn't sleep. The memory of the man's eyes haunted him. He kept thinking about the way he said, "You used to believe in things." He didn't know why, but those words hurt more than he wanted to admit. The next morning, Sundar found himself walking the same street, holding the map in his hand. He followed the line, turning corners, passing alleys and empty buildings, until he came to a quiet part of town where the sidewalks cracked and the street lamps flickered. Finally, he arrived at the circle on the map. It was an abandoned warehouse with boarded-up windows and a rusty door. Sundar hesitated, his heart pounding. Was he really going to step inside? He reached for the handle. But just as he touched it, the door creaked open from the inside. And standing there, in the dim light, was the same homeless man. Only this time he was clean-shaven, dressed in a crisp black suit, and smiling as though he had been expecting Sundar all along. "Welcome," the man said. "You made it." Sundar's breath caught in his throat. "Who are you?" he whispered. The man stepped aside, holding the door open wider. "Come in," he said. "It's time you remember who you really are." Sundar stared into the darkness beyond the door, unsure if he was ready to find out. Then he took a deep breath and stepped inside. The warehouse of forgotten dreams. The door groaned as it swung wider, and Sundar stepped inside, his polished shoes clicking softly on the cracked concrete floor. The air smelled faintly of dust and something older, like forgotten wood and memories that had been sealed away for years. He paused just beyond the threshold, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. The man in the black suit stood ahead of him, hands clasped lightly behind his back. His smile still calm and knowing. Inside, the warehouse stretched farther than Sundar expected, its ceiling lost in shadows. Along the walls were tall shelves, stacked with odd objects, yellowing books, old photographs, and cracked frames, faded toys, even what looked like pieces of broken machines. At first glance, it seemed like nothing but a strange collection of junk. But somehow, Each item seemed to hum with a quiet significance, as though every one of them carried a story too. Heavy to tell all at once, the man motioned toward a long wooden table in the center of the space. It was bare except for a single object resting on top, a worn-out notebook. Its leather cover scuffed and edges curled with time. Sundar moved closer, his curiosity battling the low hum of unease in his chest. He reached for the notebook, but the man spoke before he could touch it. "Not yet," he said softly. "First, you need to understand where you are." Sundar pulled his hand back and looked at him. "What is this place?" The man's eyes glinted in the dim light. He walked slowly around the table, trailing his fingers lightly over the notebook as he spoke. "This," he began, "is a place where forgotten dreams come to rest. The dreams people once held in their hearts before life taught them to let go. The ideas that could have changed everything. The promises people made to themselves when they were young, before the world convinced them otherwise." He stopped walking and fixed Sundar with a steady gaze. "And some of these," he continued, tapping the notebook lightly, "belong to you." A shiver ran down Sundar's spine. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, his thoughts drifted back flashes of his childhood in Chennai. Nights spent reading under the single flickering bulb. The endless questions that burned in his mind. The quiet hope that one day he might create something that truly mattered. Somewhere along the way, those hopes had been buried under meetings, deadlines, stock prices, and responsibilities. And now, here he was, staring at a stranger who seemed to know all of it. The man walked toward the nearest shelf and picked up a small glass jar filled with marbles. He held it up to the light, and the marbles sparkled faintly, as though they were alive. "Every person who has ever stepped into this place has left something behind," he said. "Sometimes they don't even know it until they see it again. Sometimes they think they've outgrown it. But these things, they wait. They always wait." He set the jar back down and returned to the table. "Go ahead," he said quietly. "Open it." Sundar reached for the notebook again. This time, he didn't hesitate. The cover was cool beneath his fingers, and when he opened it, a faint scent of paper and ink rose up, familiar and strange at the same time. The first page was blank, so was the second. But on the third, faint handwriting began to appear, his own handwriting from decades ago. Uneven and earnest. The words on the page stopped him cold. "I want to build something that makes life better. For everyone. I don't care how long it takes. I won't stop trying." His throat tightened. He turned another page and another, each one filled with sketches and notes he had scribbled as a boy, and then a young man wild inventions. Ideas for better schools, for clean water, for ways to connect people who felt alone. It was all there, raw and beautiful and full of hope. He felt the man watching him, but couldn't bring himself to look up. Instead, he kept turning pages until he reached the last one. It was different from the others. The page was torn at the edge, and written at the top in bold letters was just one word: "Why?" Beneath it, in smaller handwriting, was a single question: "Why did you stop believing?" Sundar closed the notebook slowly, his hands trembling. The question hung in the air like a weight he didn't know how to carry. Finally, he looked up at the man. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The man's expression softened. He took a step closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "I don't want anything from you. But there's someone who does." Before Sundar could ask what he meant, the man turned and walked toward the far end of the warehouse. Sundar followed, his shoes echoing louder in the silence. They passed row after row of shelves, each one more peculiar than the last. Tiny sculptures carved out of matchsticks. Letters that had never been mailed, even an old piano with only one key that still worked. At the end of the aisle, there was another door. This one was much older, its surface carved with symbols Sundar didn't recognize. The man stopped and placed his hand on the door. "What's behind there?" Sundar asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man glanced back at him, his eyes darker now, almost sad. "Behind this door," he said, "is the part of you you've been running from? The part you buried because you thought the world wouldn't understand." The part you need if you're going to find your way back. Sundar swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. He wanted to say something, to protest, but the words caught in his throat. He reached for the door handle before. He could touch it. The man's hand shot out and stopped him. Once you go through, he warned, there's no going back. Everything you see in there will stay with you forever. Sundar stared at him, feeling the weight of those words settle deep inside. He thought of the boy he used to be, the one who had written those words in the notebook. He thought of how far he had come and how much he had lost on the way. He nodded slowly. The man let go of his hand and stepped aside. Sundar placed his palm on the door. The wood was cold under his skin, and for a moment he thought he felt it pulse, faintly, like a heartbeat. Then he pushed. The door creaked open, and a blinding light poured out, so bright it forced him to shield his eyes. He stumbled forward into the light, feeling the ground shift beneath his feet. When the light faded, he found himself standing in a place he could not have imagined. He was no longer in a warehouse. He was standing in the middle of a vast field under a sky that shimmered with strange colors. In the distance, he could see figures moving, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all walking toward a towering structure that glowed faintly at its peak. It was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about it too. The figures walked slowly, as if burdened by something heavy, their heads bowed, and then Sundar realized something that made his breath catch in his throat, that the figure closest to him was himself, but younger, thinner, wearing the same faded shirt and sandals he used to wear back in Chennai. The younger Sundar stopped walking and looked up, his eyes meeting the older Sundar's with quiet accusation. "You left us here?" The younger one said, his voice carrying across the strange air. "You promised you wouldn't forget." Sundar froze, staring back at his younger self, feeling an ache deep in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. "What is this place?" he whispered. But the younger Sundar just pointed toward the glowing tower in the distance and said, "You already know." And then he turned and began walking again, his figure fading slowly into the crowd of others. Sundar stood there, rooted to the spot, torn between following and turning back, knowing that whatever lay ahead would change everything. And behind him, he heard the soft voice of the man in the suit, faint but unmistakable, carried through the strange wind. "If you keep going," the voice called out, "you'll have to choose what kind of man you really want to be." Sundar took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the choice pressing down on him. Then he took his first step forward into the field of forgotten dreams. And somewhere far ahead, the glowing tower began to pulse as though it too was waiting for him. The path of echo as the ground beneath Sundar's feet felt soft now, almost like sand, but it shimmered faintly, as though tiny fragments of light were mixed into the soil. Each step left behind a faint imprint that glowed for a few seconds before fading. He kept his eyes fixed on the glowing tower in the distance. It rose impossibly high into the strange sky, its surface shifting colors, gold to silver to blue. Around him, the field stretched endlessly, dotted with countless figures all walking in the same direction, each carrying something heavy in their arms or on their backs. As he walked, Sundar began to notice the silence. No one spoke. The figures around him moved slowly, their heads down, eyes vacant. Now and then he caught a glimpse of a face that looked familiar, a childhood friend, an old teacher, even his mother, only to see it dissolve into someone else when he looked closer. Every time he tried to speak to one of them, they kept walking, as though they couldn't hear him at all. He quickened his pace, weaving between the figures, feeling the weight of their quiet suffering press against his chest. Some carried books that seemed to burn their hands. Others dragged broken machines behind them on heavy chains. One man carried an empty picture frame that rattled with every step. Sundar wanted to help them, but every time he reached out, they would flinch away and whisper words he couldn't quite hear. Soon the air began to change. It grew warmer, thicker, harder to breathe. The ground sloped upward and strange. Dark shapes began to emerge from the mist ahead, trees without leaves, their branches twisted like claws. As he climbed, The figures around him thinned out, leaving him alone on the path. That was when he heard it, the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned and saw a woman standing there. She wore a simple white dress, and her hair was tied back in a way that reminded him painfully of his wife, Angeli. But her face was shadowed, unreadable, her features blurred as though she stood behind glass. She tilted her head slightly. "Why you walk so fast?" she asked, her voice quiet but carrying easily in the strange air. Sundar swallowed hard. I have to reach the tower," he said. "I need to understand." The woman shook her head slowly. "What will you do when you get there?" she asked. "Do you even know what you're looking for?" He opened his mouth, but no answer came. He realized he didn't know. All he knew was the heaviness in his chest, the faint echo of the man in the suit's voice, and the memory of his younger self pointing toward the tower. The woman took a step closer. "You've already forgotten, haven't you?" she said. "You forgot why you started walking a long time ago. Now you only run because you're afraid to stop." He felt a rush of shame and anger, but before he could respond, she raised a hand and pointed past him toward the tower. "Then go," she said simply, "but don't be surprised by what you find." And just like that, she was gone. The air where she had stood shimmered faintly before settling back into stillness. Sundar stood there for a long moment, her words echoing in his head. Then he turned and kept walking. The path became steeper, narrower, the strange light of the tower growing brighter and harsher the closer he got. Soon the ground began to crack beneath his feet, revealing thin veins of glowing gold that pulsed faintly. The heat was stronger now, and sweat trickled down his neck. He came to a fork in the path. One side sloped gently downward, bathed in soft, cool light. The other rose sharply, jagged rocks lining the way, and a faint, distant rumble shook the air, and there, standing at the fork, was the man in the black suit. He was leaning against one of the twisted trees, arms crossed, his face calm as ever. But his eyes were different now, darker, heavier, as though he carried a sadness he could no longer hide. "You made it farther than most," the man said, "but now you have to choose." Sundar stared at him. "Choose what?" He asked. The man straightened and gestured toward the two paths. "One way will take you to answers," he said. "The other will take you to the truth." Sundar felt a chill run through him. "Aren't they the same?" The man gave a faint, almost bitter smile. "No," he said. "Not even close." The silence stretched between them, and Sundar felt the weight of the choice pressing down harder. With every second, he glanced down the gentler path. It looked safer, more welcoming, the kind of path that promised comfort. But his eyes kept returning to the steeper path, the one that glowed faintly at its edges, the one where the air shimmered with heat and faint cries could be heard if he listened hard enough. Duddy took a breath and stepped toward the steeper path. Man in the suit nodded slightly. "Good," he murmured. "At least you're honest." As Sundar began to climb, the ground grew hotter under his feet, the air thicker. Sharp stones cut into his hands and knees when he stumbled, but he kept going. The cries in the distance grew louder, now voices calling his name, accusing, pleading, sometimes weeping. He tried to shut them out, but they burrowed into his mind like splinters. At one point, he slipped and fell hard, scraping his palms bloody on the stones. As he lay there, catching his breath, he heard footsteps again, this time many of them. When he looked up, he saw a group of figures standing on the rocks above him. Their faces clear now, unmistakable. They were all versions of himself. One was a boy with wide, hopeful eyes and a notebook clutched in his arms. Another was the young engineer he had been when he first came to America, his tie loose and his eyes full of determination. Another was older, dressed in the suits he wore now, but with a tiredness in his eyes that mirrored the way he felt inside. There were dozens of them, some happy, some angry, some broken. They all stared down at him in silence. Then one of them, a version of himself he barely recognized, hollow-eyed and thin, spoke. "You left us behind," it said. "You forgot?" "What mattered?" The others nodded in agreement, their voices rising one by one. You chose the easy victories. You traded meaning for power. You stopped listening. You stopped dreaming. The words struck him like blows, each one sharper than the last. He covered his ears, but the voices only grew louder, filling the air until it felt like the rocks themselves were shaking. Stop, he whispered. Please. And then, all at once, the voices fell silent when he opened his eyes. He was alone again. The figures had vanished, leaving only the faint glow of the tower ahead. Closer now than ever, he stood slowly, his legs trembling but steady beneath him. He wiped the blood from his palms and kept climbing, the air so hot now it burned his lungs. Last, after what felt like hours, he reached a flat ledge at the base of the tower. Up close, it was even more strange, its surface alive with light and shadow, shifting and whispering as though it held 1,000 voices. Inside, waiting at the base, was the man in the suit. But now, the man's face was different, softer, older. His eyes no longer dark, but bright with something Sundar couldn't name. And in his hands, he held the same notebook Sundar had seen in the warehouse. The man held it out to him. You've carried this all your life, he said, but you never finished it. Sundar reached for the notebook, his fingers brushing against the worn leather. He opened it, and for the first time, the final page was no longer blank. There, written in his own handwriting, was a single line. What you choose next will decide whether you wake up or stay asleep. The man watched him quietly. Sundar looked from the notebook to the tower, its light pulsing stronger now, almost unbearably bright. What happens if I go inside? Sundar asked. The man tilted his head, his faint smile returning. That, he said, is up to you. Sundar felt his heart pounding in his chest, louder than the rumble of the ground beneath him, louder than the whispers of the tower. He took a step forward. Then another. The man in the suit stayed where he was, watching. And as Sundar reached out and placed his hand against the glowing surface of the tower, the light flared suddenly, blinding and hot, and the ground seemed to fall away beneath him. He gasped as the world around him began to dissolve into light and sound. And somewhere far off, he thought he heard the voice of the boy he used to be laughing, crying, calling his name. And just before everything went white, he whispered to himself, I remember now. Asterisk, the mirror of humility. When the light finally faded, Sundar opened his eyes to find himself lying on soft grass under a sky painted with streaks of orange and violet. The heat and the crushing silence of the tower were gone, replaced by the faint hum of wind through tall trees and the distant sound of water flowing over stones. At first he thought he was back in the field of forgotten dreams, but the air here was different, cooler, calmer, almost comforting. He sat up slowly, his hands brushing over the blades of grass, and looked around. He was on the edge of what seemed to be a small village. The houses were simple, made of wood and clay, with smoke rising gently from their chimneys. Children ran barefoot through the narrow paths, their laughter mingling with the low murmur of conversation. And though the people moved with quiet purpose, there was no rush, no heaviness in their steps. They looked at peace. Sundar stood and walked toward them, feeling strangely self-conscious, aware of how out of place he must look in his expensive clothes and polished shoes. As he entered the village, the people began to notice him. They didn't smile, they didn't speak, but they watched him with eyes that were calm and full of something he couldn't quite name. A boy no older than 10 approached him and offered a small wooden bowl of water without saying a word. Sundar accepted it gratefully, drank deeply, and handed it back. The boy nodded and ran off to join the others. Ahead, near the center of the village, stood the man in the suit, but this time he wore no suit. Instead, he was dressed like the others, a simple tunic and sandals, his hair loose around his shoulders. And though he looked different, Sundar knew it was him. His presence was unmistakable. You've come far, the man said as Sundar reached him, but this is where the real work begins. Sundar glanced around at the quiet village. What is this place? He asked, his voice low. The man gestured toward the people around them. This is where people come to remember what it means to be small, he said. Where they learn to see without being seen, to give without being thanked, to live without being noticed. Sundar frowned. But I thought the tower was the end. I thought I'd find my answers there. The man gave him a faint, almost amused smile. You found what you wanted there, he said, but not what you needed. He turned and began walking toward a narrow path that led out of the village and into a dense forest. Sundar hesitated only a moment before following. The forest was quiet but alive, its trees tall and heavy with leaves that whispered as the wind passed through. Shafts of golden light pierced the canopy, illuminating the path in patches. As they walked, Sundar noticed carvings in the trees, tiny names and symbols, some so faint they were almost invisible. He reached out to trace one of them, and a chill ran up his spine. It was his own name carved deep into the bark. What is this? He asked. The man glanced over his shoulder. These are the promises you made, he said. Every step you've taken left a mark, and every mark tells a story. They walked on in silence until the trees thinned and the path opened into a clearing. In the center stood a tall mirror framed in wood, its surface covered in a thin layer of dust. The man stopped beside it and gestured for Sundar to step closer. Look, he said. Sundar hesitated, then moved to stand before the mirror. At first, all he saw was his own reflection, tired eyes, creased forehead, a man burdened by more than he could carry. But as he watched, the image began to shift. He saw himself as a boy again, sitting cross-legged on a dusty floor, sketching wild inventions in a notebook. Then he saw himself at his first job, staying late at the office, eyes bright with ambition. Then himself at a podium, addressing thousands of employees, his voice confident but his hands trembling behind the lectern. Scene after scene flashed before him, moments of triumph, moments of failure, moments of quiet loneliness no one else had ever seen. And then the mirror showed him something he wasn't prepared for. He saw the boy from the village again, the one who had handed him water earlier. But this time the boy was sitting alone in the dirt, holding a broken toy and staring at nothing. Sundar watched as the boy looked up, his eyes meeting Sundar's through the mirror. They were filled with quiet accusation. You forgot me. The boy whispered. Sundar's chest tightened. He reached out toward the mirror, but the surface was cold and unyielding. The man's voice came from behind him. Every success comes at a cost, he said. But you never asked who paid it. Sundar turned, his breath catching. What do you mean? The man's expression was solemn now. Every time you chose to climb higher, someone else bore the weight you left behind. The question is whether you're willing to go back and carry it. Sundar stared at him, the words sinking into his bones. How? He asked, his voice breaking. The man stepped closer and placed a hand on his shoulder. You begin by becoming small, he said. By serving instead of being served. By listening instead of speaking. He gestured toward the path leading. Back to the village. Go to them, he said. Help them without asking why. Stay until you understand. Sundar looked at the mirror one last time, then nodded slowly. He walked back down the path, his legs heavy but steady. When he returned to the village, the people looked up from their work, their eyes following him as he approached. He saw a woman struggling to carry a bundle of firewood and hurried to take it from her. She nodded once in quiet thanks, but said nothing. He saw an old man sitting alone, trying to mend a fishing net with trembling fingers, and he knelt to help. His hands clumsy but willing. Hours passed, maybe days. Sundar lost track of time as he moved from person to person, carrying water, mending roofs, cleaning tools. With each task, something inside him began to shift. The noise in his head grew quieter. The weight on his chest began to lift. And though no one spoke to him, their silent acceptance felt more meaningful than any applause he had ever received. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the village in gold, he sat alone on a stone near the edge of the clearing. His hands were blistered, his clothes stained with dirt. But his heart felt lighter than it had in years. The man in the tunic appeared beside him without a sound. You're learning, he said softly. Sundar looked up at him. I don't know. If I can ever make it right, he admitted. The man smiled faintly. It's not about making it right, he said. It's about choosing differently every day. He reached into his sleeve and pulled out the notebook again, handing it to Sundar. Right, he said. Fill the last page. Sundar opened the notebook slowly. The final page was still there, blank except for the line at the top. What you choose next will decide whether you wake up or stay asleep. He stared at it for a long time, then raised the pen. But before he could write, a sudden cry rang out from the center of the village. He looked up to see smoke rising, dark and thick, curling into the twilight sky. People were running now, panic in their movements. The air filled with shouting, the smell of fire and fear. Sundar rose to his feet, heart pounding, the notebook clutched tight in his hand. He turned to the man. What's happening? He asked. The man's eyes were grim now, his voice low. This, he said, is the test. And then he stepped back into the shadows, leaving Sundar standing alone as the flames roared higher and the cries grew louder. Sundar took a deep breath, the heat of the fire already on his face, and started running toward the chaos. Asterisk through the fiery air was thick with smoke and ash. The smell of burning wood and something sharper like fear filling Sundar's lungs as he ran toward the center of the village. Flames leapt hungrily from rooftop to rooftop, lighting the sky a furious orange, crackling and snapping as though alive. Children screamed and clung to their mothers. Old men stumbled through the haze, coughing, their arms full of whatever precious things they had managed to grab. Sundar didn't think. He threw himself into the chaos, his feet slipping on the dry grass as he reached the first house already engulfed in flames. The door hung crooked, and through the thick smoke he could see the shape of someone trapped inside, a small girl pressed into a corner, her eyes wide with terror. Without pausing, he wrapped a cloth around his mouth, lowered himself, and crawled. Through the door, the heat searing his skin even through his clothes. Asterisk. The fire roared around him, greedy and relentless. The ceiling groaned above, threatening to collapse at any second. He reached the girl, scooped her into his arms, and turned back toward the door. Every step was agony, the smoke choking him, the heat clawing at his skin, but somehow he found his way out and stumbled into the open air. The girl clung to him, sobbing quietly into his shoulder, and he set her down gently in the grass before turning back toward the flames. Because there were more all around him, the villagers moved like shadows through the smoke, trying to salvage what they could, pulling loved ones from danger. Sundar didn't stop. He ran to the next house and the next, shouting for anyone left inside, helping drag buckets of water from the well to douse the flames, even though it barely seemed to help. His hands blistered and blackened, his throat raw from breathing the smoke. But he kept moving, and always just at the edge of his vision, he saw the man in the tunic standing in the shadows, watching, never moving, just watching. At one point, Sundar collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving, his hand shaking so badly he could barely lift another bucket. He looked up at the man, anger and despair bubbling in his chest. "Help me," he gasped, his voice hoarse and broken. "Please." The man tilted his head slightly, his face unreadable. "You still don't understand," he said quietly, almost to himself. Then he turned and disappeared into the smoke. Sundar stared after him, fury and confusion mixing in his chest. Didn't the man see? Didn't he care? How could he just stand there while everything burned? But there was no time to dwell on it. Another scream rose from somewhere deeper in the village, sharper and more desperate than the others. Sundar forced himself to his feet and ran toward it, ignoring the pain in his lungs, the dizziness in his head. He found the source at the largest house in the village. Flames had already consumed the lower walls, and the roof sagged dangerously. Through a small window, Sundar could just make out a figure trapped inside, a young boy, clutching a wooden toy and banging helplessly against the glass. Sundar didn't hesitate. He wrapped his arms in cloth, ducked low, and charged through. The heat inside was unbearable, and the air shimmered with it, but he pushed forward, calling out to the boy. The child turned toward him, eyes wide and terrified. "Come here," Sundar shouted. Reaching out, the boy hesitated only a moment before running into his arms. Sundar scooped him up, shielding him from the falling embers with his own body as he stumbled back toward the door. But just as they reached it, a beam above gave way with a deafening crack and crashed down, blocking the exit. He spun around, searching for another way out, and his eyes landed on the window. He kicked at it with his foot, once, twice, until the glass shattered. Flames licked at his heels as he pushed the boy through the opening and then climbed out himself, tumbling into the cool grass outside. Villagers rushed forward to take the boy from his arms, but Sundar barely noticed. He lay there on the ground, staring up at the strange sky, his chest heaving, every muscle screaming in pain. Around him, the fire still raged, but it was fading now. The villagers working together to beat it back, their movements quicker. More coordinated dot, and then the man was there again, standing over him, his expression softer this time. "Why didn't you help them?" Sundar demanded weakly. His voice cracking got the man crouched down so their eyes were level. "Because they didn't need me," he said. "They needed you." Sundar blinked at him, his thoughts spinning. I don't understand." The man reached out and placed a hand lightly over Sundar's chest. "You've spent your whole life trying to climb higher," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "But up there, you forget how to feel the ground beneath your feet. You forget how to carry others. Tonight, you chose to stay low. You chose to carry them. And in doing so, you began to remember who you are." Sundar felt a lump rise in his throat. He closed his eyes, letting the words sink in. When he opened them again, the man was already walking away. The villagers gathered around Sundar, their eyes no longer distant, no longer questioning. They reached down to help him stand, their hands steady and warm. For the first time, he saw them truly smile, not just polite, not just grateful, but full of quiet respect. They nodded to him, and he felt something shift deep inside his chest, something that felt a little like peace. He stayed with them through the night, helping to rebuild what the fire had taken. When the sun rose the next morning, the village glowed with soft golden light, the smoke gone, the air cool and clean. Sundar sat by the well, his hands raw and blistered, his clothes torn and stained. But his heart steadied Dot, and then he saw the notebook again, lying on the stones beside him. Picked it up slowly, his fingers tracing the familiar leather cover. When he opened it, the final page was waiting, still blank except for the line at the top. "What you choose next will decide whether you wake up or stay asleep." He stared at it for a long moment. Then, with hands that no longer shook, he began to write. He filled the page with words, honest, simple, full of the truths he had tried so hard to forget. He wrote about the boy who dreamed of changing the world, about the man who had lost his way, about the people who had reminded him what it meant to serve. And finally, he wrote a promise not to climb higher, but to go deeper, to stay close to the ground, to carry others when they couldn't carry themselves. When he finished, the page shimmered faintly, and the words sank into the paper like water soaking into dry earth. He closed the notebook, and that was when the man appeared again this time, standing at the edge of the village, wearing his black suit once more, his face calm but unreadable. "It's time," the man said simply. Sundar stood, slipping the notebook under his arm. "Time for what?" he asked. The man's eyes glinted faintly, and a faint smile touched his lips. "To see what's on the other side." He turned and began walking toward the forest. Sundar hesitated only a moment before following as they passed through the trees. The light around them began to change, growing brighter, sharper, until it was almost blinding. And just before they stepped beyond the edge of the forest, the man glanced back over his shoulder. "Are you ready?" he asked. Sundar took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything he had learned, everything he had endured, settling in his chest. "Yes," he said quietly. And then they stepped into the light. The other Siddha, the light was so bright, Sundar had to close his eyes. It felt like stepping into the heart of a star, warm, blinding, endless. But unlike the fire from before, this heat didn't burn. It wrapped around him instead, like something alive, something welcoming. He felt the ground shift beneath his feet, softer now, and the faint pressure of a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. When he opened his eyes again, he was standing on a bridge. It stretched out infinitely in both directions, suspended in a sky that was neither day nor night, but some strange in-between, a canvas of swirling colors and drifting stars. Below him there was nothing but a shimmering ocean of light, deep, and infinite. Ahead, at the far end of the bridge, he could see a faint figure waiting. Beside him stood the man in the suit, calm as ever, his hands clasped lightly behind his back. "This is the other side," the man said quietly. Sundar looked around, awe and unease twisting together in his chest. "What is this place?" The man's eyes softened. "This is where you choose what kind of life you want to return to," he said. "What kind of man you want to be when you wake." Sundar stared down at the bridge beneath his feet. It shimmered, faintly, threads of light weaving through the planks like veins of gold. "And if I don't cross it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man tilted his head slightly, considering. "Then you stay here," he said, "drifting, waiting, fading, just another soul who chose sleep over waking." The weight of the words settled over Sundar like a heavy cloak. He looked ahead at the figure waiting at the far end of the bridge, feeling something inside him stir, a strange mixture of fear and longing. "Who is that?" he asked. The man's faint smile returned. "Go find out." Sundar took a deep breath, feeling his heart hammering his chest. Then he stepped forward. The bridge felt alive under his feet, each plank humming faintly as though acknowledging his presence. With every step, memories began to surface. Memories of his childhood, the streets of Chennai, his mother's voice calling him to dinner. The night he stayed awake sketching designs for a new kind of phone. The day he first set foot in America. But along with those came darker memories of all the times he had turned away from those who needed him, of promises broken, of moments when ambition had blinded him to kindness. He kept walking. The figure at the end of the bridge grew clearer. Now it was sitting on a simple wooden chair, its head bowed, hands resting on its knees. Sundar slowed as he drew closer, his breath catching when he finally saw the face. It was himself, but not as he was now. Not in a suit or even the weary version he had seen before. This Sundar looked calm, content, his eyes bright with something he hadn't seen in himself for years. Hope. The two of them stared at each other in silence. Then the seated Sundar spoke. "You've seen what happens when you forget," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "You felt what it's like to carry others. Now you have to choose which man you want to be." The standing Sundar swallowed hard, his throat tight. "How do I choose?" he asked.